All right, y'all. We always have technical difficulties, so let us know if you can hear us okay, and we'll get started as soon as everything starts working right. Get started as soon as everything. Josh, give me a mic check.
Mic check, 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Bueller? Bueller?
Get started as soon as everything.
Bueller? 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 All right, well, I'm going to start it off. Daniel's figuring out whatever's going on his end. I think he can't really hear the audio from me, but strangely enough, it's in the broadcast, so it sounds like everything's working. Somebody said my gain is a little high, so I'll just try not to speak up too much. Yeah, it's been an interesting couple weeks in college football, to say the least, and we've been pretty active on Twitter and try to put out some videos on YouTube that we haven't been able to stay up to date as much as we'd like. Um, just trying to make sure that we're on top of what's going on in college football. I think the biggest takeaway for both of us is we're kind of concerned about long term how all these changes are not going to just affect the teams involved or the conferences involved, but how they're going to affect the average fan, particularly fans that aren't fans of those teams. So if you're Oklahoma or you're Texas, you're an SEC fan, I think this merger of teams is probably going to make you better off, at least in the short run. Um, the truth of the matter is we're really more concerned about the teams that aren't involved in that. The teams like I don't know, Baylor. I think the one that may suffer the most in this conversation is probably TCU. And if you're a Baylor fan or an Oklahoma State fan or a TCU fan, are you going to want to tune into college football if you're not part of the big stage, so to speak? I don't know if the answer to that is actually yes. So um, now there's an echo in the broadcast. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Sounds fixed now, apparently. But do you guys have any questions before we start off with things you're interested in or what people's curiosities are? I mean, we've been pretty vocal on our opinions, which basically come down to the fact that we don't think any of this is a good thing in terms of how stuff's going to go long term, right? Um, yeah, it's fixed on his end how you can hear him, but the problem is I'm not able to hear him currently, so I'm not sure if he's going to be able to get that rectified. But they are saying in chat it's fixed, Daniel. Do Baylor fans want to tune into the normal schedule, though? I mean, there was a time when Baylor was good, and then Baylor became not good. But that's a pretty funny comment. I'm not gonna lie. Ideal SEC divisions pods. So, first question is if you have the merger of divisions and pods, what is it gonna look like? And what would be the best way to do it? I think everybody's sort of in agreement that the best way to do this is pods. And when people say pods, it'd be four I mean, people say do away with divisions, but it really is still keeping divisions, right? You just got 4 divisions of 4 rather than trying to make do with the division of 8. I don't think a division of 8 is really feasible, even in a 9-game conference schedule. You're playing 7 games in your division and only 2 in the other, which means you're going to rotate every 5 years to get through the 9, right? And if you have a permanent that's only 1 rotating, it's just not feasible. So the only way to do it is to have 4 groups of 4. You play the other 3 in your set. There are 3 other groups, and if you play 2 from each of those groups, then you're playing 2, 4, 6 plus your 3. That's 9 games. So a 9-game conference slate. You play all the ones in your pod every year, and then you play half the ones in the other pods, and then every other year you rotate those. And so that's kind of ideal. You want people to be able to play. Well, you want the student athletes to be able to play every team in their conference at least every couple years. You don't want this situation where kids are graduating and never playing teams in their own conference. And, just geographically, it actually works out pretty well because in the East, you've got Kentucky, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, who are all big sort of connected natural rivals. You probably would have Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt that's in the next tier. Again, sort of shifting over. You maintain 2 big rivalries with Alabama and Tennessee and with Auburn and Alabama. And then it's a little more difficult when you shift west because the obvious thing is Oklahoma, Texas, Texas A&M, and then maybe Missouri. But putting that many of those schools in one tier is probably a little weirdly lopsided. I think that's too strong of a pod. So I think what ends up happening, and A&M may prefer it, is A&M does not go in that pod. So you end up with Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and then probably Arkansas, and then the other pod would be Ole Miss, Mississippi State, LSU, and then A&M. I have a hard time finding the real negatives in the pod situation. I think it really only does good things for the conference and makes the matchups a little bit more interesting. Strategy for the other conferences to counter the SEC. I mean, the strategy to counter the SEC is to try to bring in more schools. Period. I mean, the strategy to counter the SEC is to try to bring in the best group of schools you possibly can, and then, use those schools to be as effective as you can. I think the problem is that just there aren't that many good schools left on the table. Like if you talk about the ACC with Notre Dame, Notre Dame was great. You saw how much that helped the ACC with the rivalry between them and Clemson. I think Florida State and Miami are about to do a lot better than they have been in recent years, which is probably a pretty big improvement. But for the other conferences, the Big Ten, who do you pick up? Seriously, who do you pick up? People have put out Iowa State. I mean, I made a big comment about this on Twitter. Iowa State is in a state with 3 million people. They share a market with Iowa that they already have. And every time you add a school, it's like carving up an extra piece of the pie, right? So you want to make the pie bigger to account for the fact that you have to give up an extra slice. And Iowa State's just not going to do that. So yeah, I don't know that Iowa State's the answer. And then you start really running into questions for the Pac-12 and for the Big Ten. What is the solution for those conferences? And I think it's going to be gobbling up as many schools as they can and the best ones available. Notre Dame will be the crown jewel for whoever wants to get them. And then beyond them, Oklahoma State has a pretty good draw. Texas Tech is a pretty good academic institution and a pretty good athletic one. Oklahoma State's another one. But they're all kind of in no man's land. And Texas Tech will have more of a draw because of where they're located. Oklahoma State is in a difficult position, being where they're at geographically and the number of people that watch them as a market. It's big in the Pac merge. I keep hearing talk about the Pac-12 and the Big Ten merging. I mean, it's possible, but I sincerely doubt it. Those conferences are pretty disconnected in a lot of ways. They play in the Rose Bowl and have for years, but they're not tightly wound. I don't think anybody has an interest in making a conference that large. And if you make a conference of 28 teams, it's extremely unwieldy. It may be one way to sort of fight the SEC, or at least it is in your mind, but you're not going to play very many teams in the conference, right? You maybe play a third of the conference every year. So the fact that it's huge doesn't matter. Your schedule you could be a Big Ten team and play almost all Pac-12 teams or something. I mean, it's just not going to really move the needle much. because if you're the Big Ten in particular, the Big Ten absorbing the Pac-12 makes the Big Ten worse because you just dilute it. The reason the SEC just got stronger is they added 2 top-tier teams, not teams that are just an average SEC teams. They are equivalent to an upper-crust SEC team. Texas is the largest revenue school in the country, and Oklahoma has been a dominant school for a long time. So when asking for, aren't I a lawyer? I am, in fact, a lawyer. I couldn't tell you if this is going to go to litigation. I don't think anybody expects this to actually go to 2025. I think Texas and Oklahoma have made clear they're going to abide by the terms of their contract. And what does that mean? A little bit of a different question, right? Does the contract have the ability to get out of it? My understanding is that it does. At the very least, they can sacrifice 2 years of TV revenue to be able to cancel the contract. If they do that, that's not a breach of contract, right? That's exercising your contract rights, and it's a contract right determination. So when you talk about breach, you usually mean doing something the contract doesn't allow. And so I think Texas and Oklahoma are going to abide by it. But frankly, I think they're really just biding their time because they know with the rest of the conference, again, the last one on that boat is going to end up at the bottom of the Atlantic. And so it's probably going to splinter sooner rather than later, and people are going to find other conferences to jump to. And once that happens and the conference falls apart, then Oklahoma can leave with no penalty. So I think there probably is a little bit of a waiting game going on there. Big Ten should only take Notre Dame. I mean, I've been pretty vocal that Maryland and Rutgers was a mistake. I kind of evaluate Big Ten schedules personally based off how many of the original Big Ten are on their schedule. When you play Nebraska, Maryland, and Rutgers, it's the equivalent of a Big Ten schedule and a couple Big East teams, right? I mean, technically they're Big Ten, but I've always thought it was kind of ridiculous when you have a 6-game conference schedule against former Big Ten teams, and you got Nebraska, Maryland, and Rutgers, and then you call that a 9-game Big Ten schedule. It's really not. It's almost more like a 6-game Big Ten schedule plus some decent Big East and out of conference games. So that's the problem you get when you add Pac-12, is what I'm saying, essentially, that you just end up with even more of that where playing conference games doesn't really mean a ton. Unless Notre Dame breaks their contracts, they have to join the ACC if they join in football. Yeah, I'm not really sure how that works, frankly. I don't know the contracts. I'm not sure that they're public. The ACC probably is some level public, but Notre Dame's a private entity. When you deal with Notre Dame and USC, you get some weird things because they are private schools and they don't have to disclose everything the way a public school does. There was an issue a little while back where somebody was trying to flout highest revenue schools and how high certain schools were and how we were discounting school X, Y, or Z, particularly in regard to Texas. I didn't make a big deal of it, but the charts they were throwing around actually didn't include Notre Dame, and they didn't include USC, and they didn't include any private school. And all the public schools don't report these things equally. And a lot of public schools have created separate entities to run their athletic department, separate corporate structures. And they've done that a little bit to sort of shield from Freedom of Information Act stuff, frankly. And it is a little bit effective. So I don't know what the contract terms are for Notre Dame, and I'm not even sure that they're public. I don't think they really are. So I don't think anyone's really quite aware of what Notre Dame's options actually are. Yeah, they're saying USC, Oregon, UCLA, Washington, Stanford would get the Big 12 into a better total school count. I don't think the Big 12 has any hope of absorbing the Pac-12. The Pac-12 schools know that where they are at is relatively stable, and you're not going to leave that to go to a place that's unstable and hope people come with you. You would take, maybe the top of the big Pac-12 and the top of the Big 12 would align, but you have to understand the Pac-12 is closely aligned on other sports. They have more sports than any other conference. They're very proud of that fact. They have a lot of Olympic sports, and academically they're very closely tied. That conference, their greatest weakness in recent years has been a lack of attention to detail, if you will, with their athletic programs and the football programs in particular. But that isn't to say that they don't care or that they've been unsuccessful. It's more they're so academically focused that they're not really concerned with how well the football programs are doing, and they're not willing to do certain things to make them successful, not willing to shift the budgets or invest in the same way that other conferences are. But what all that means, in my view, is I think it's highly unlikely the Pac-12 schools are going to do anything other than stay in the Pac-12. And if the Pac-12 takes a school, probably a lot like the Big Ten, they're going to be really picky about the academic standards of the schools they're picking up, and then the totality of the school's athletic department, not just if they're good in football or basketball. And this is, again, where the Iowa State example probably is a really not a great one, because when you start looking at how many sports they offer, where their academic reputation is, the number of people in that media market, the revenue of the school, the reputation of the school as an all-around entity isn't as strong. And like Maryland and Rutgers, why were they taken? Because as a holistic institution, they're very considered to be very prestigious institutions. Maryland is a big school. They're very, they're well funded. They're academically reputable. Same thing with Rutgers. The fact that their football programs weren't very good probably should have been a concern, but it wasn't as big a deal to them actually as it is to most of us as fans. Um, People ask if the SEC will stop at 16. I think their immediate intention is, because it's hard to run a conference with more than that. There's been some rumors that they reached out to Michigan, Ohio State. They reached out to Miami, Florida State about making a super conference. One, I think that's probably pretty deceptive. I kind of doubt that those schools would really give a lot to the FCC, and particularly Florida State, a good academic institution, actually a pretty darnly high ranked one, but not a very high revenue area. As a TV market, you overlap way too much with Florida, so you're going to lose money as most schools by taking them in. And then Florida and Georgia really don't want them in the conference from a competition aspect. So that clued me into the fact that it probably isn't just about expanding the SEC. It wouldn't shock me if they had some of those conversations, but it's not about expanding the SEC. It's probably more just, hey, are you guys willing to talk to the Big Ten and the ACC and form a 64-team super conference? I imagine that's the push. And I want to say this before I forget. So Funky Fudge 11, thanks for the super chat. I appreciate you guys, donating to support us. And we wish we could do more of this ourselves. Again, as I opted to disclose, I am an attorney. My life is pretty busy. Daniel is a programmer himself, does a lot of complicated work, and has been, I guess, sort of helping launch a company without saying too much. So he's been extremely busy himself. So between the two of us, when we drop off, it's usually that we don't have time. This is a labor of love for us. Frankly, it's not, it's something that has to be worth a while to do. But we definitely have big boy jobs, and sometimes those get pretty time consuming. If I'm in a major litigation or something, I can't always be in a position to record. John Johnson, thanks for the super chat. And he asked the question, does the addition of Oklahoma and Texas hurt the current recruiting of top-tier SEC teams or no change? There's been a lot of back and forth on that, and I've heard people put forward two theories. One is that it will hurt them because Texas and Oklahoma will start recruiting away from the SEC. The other school of thought is that it won't really hurt the SEC teams. I'll tell you my theory. I think it will help Texas and Oklahoma, and I think it will have little effect to or will help the other SEC schools. I think what's going to happen is if you're Texas, you're going to stop losing quite as many kids out of Texas and Oklahoma. You're going to be able to pull some from SEC country. That will slightly hurt other schools. But in exchange, if you're Ole Miss or you're Georgia or you're Alabama, they're going to be that much more capable of going into Texas. I think kids are going to be very comfortable now going to any school in the SEC because they're part of the same conference, and they're going to be used to seeing them on TV. Those two will kind of offset each other. So I think the biggest benefit will be Oklahoma and Texas. And really, where does this come from? Well, it's going to come from Baylor and TCU and Oklahoma State. They're the ones that are going to miss out on kids in general. And the footprint of the SEC is just going to grow. It's also going to hurt the Pac-12. It's going to hurt the Big Ten. They're going to kind of poach from outside the conference as well. So Oklahoma and Texas will be helped. But all those additional gains, particularly in the state of Texas, is going to offset it for the rest of the SEC schools. At least that's my general opinion on the matter. I'm trying to go down to the next question. Trying to scroll down. You guys give me questions in chat. I'll try to answer them, but I'm not seeing too many. Talk about FSU being a brand, which is becoming more important. I mean, brands are important, but college football is still really watched regionally. So being a brand is good, but the question is, if you're a Florida fan, are you already watching FSU or no? And if you pick up Florida State, you get all the people that are currently watching a Florida State game. And the question is, are the Florida State fans that you pick up going to then start watching Ole Miss or Alabama or Kentucky? And I bet a lot of Florida State fans already watch a lot of those games. So you're already getting those eyeballs. So adding Florida State means you get the revenue of the Florida State game itself, but you probably don't get a ton of extra eyeballs in the other games. That's what makes Oklahoma and Texas a big deal. There's a lot of fans in those conferences, and they're going to watch a bunch of games that they were not previously watching. I know for a fact a lot of Texas and Oklahoma fans haven't been watching Kentucky football, and they're going to start watching some Kentucky football, and that's what makes up for the loss in revenue. So when you have an overlapping market where Florida State fans are already watching the Florida game, picking up the Florida State fan doesn't give you an extra eyeball for the Florida game. It only gets you that Florida State game. And that's where it's really tough to pick up a school that's in an overlapping market with where you're already at. I've made the point that Cincinnati for the Big Ten actually makes some sense, and that's because it's so far south in Ohio, and it's such a populous state that even though there's an overlap, there's so many people in that region that you might actually draw enough eyeballs to Big Ten football that wasn't already watching it, possibly, and particularly when you start bleeding south from Ohio. Could the Big Ten grab Texas A&M? Texas A&M is not going to leave the SEC. They've got a pretty cushy deal. They are not happy, but the word on the street is that they're voted, or the Board of Regents voted to accept Texas and Oklahoma. They're not thrilled with the situation, but they were, I'm sure, understanding. The SEC brought them in for their own gain, and it helped both parties. And it may be a slight tick down for A&M, but it's better for the conference. And quite frankly, what's better for the conference is better for A&M. But A&M and the Big Ten would be a weird fit. I don't think they're interested in doing that. Thoughts on UNC, I should say, Mac Brown. I'm interested to see where North Carolina is at. I think people underestimate the personnel losses they had this past season. People get a little too wrapped up on if they can recognize the returning quarterback, and sometimes people don't pay attention to losses at running back, losses at receiver. Those were serious NFL talents they had at skill positions last year. And one thing I know in Longo's offense is the ability of his players to go down and get the ball is a huge difference. I mean, when they had Longo at Ole Miss, I think one year they had A.J. Brown and Metcalf, and they were just a force. I mean, they were darn near unstoppable. And when they didn't have those guys, it was a completely different picture. So I have real questions about UNC. I do think they're on the incline. The recruiting and all is going to make them be something of a power in the ACC going forward. I've been very vocal the fact that I think they might have beat Clemson last year. That's mainly because their passing game was very good. The ACC lacked competent passing games for the most part, and Clemson got really exposed in the secondary at the end of the year and with Notre Dame. But I do think next year might be more of a rebuilding year. I want to dig in more on that, but they lost a lot of pieces and a lot of really good pieces, and they haven't quite built up enough talent to be able to just reload from that yet. I think it's coming, but we're a couple of years away from there to being more stability. How long will it be before Auburn is a contender? Short answer, I don't know that Auburn's going to be a championship contender in the near future, and it's probably going to be another coach. We'll do a preview. I'm not high on Harsin. Maybe that's a little bit worth a tangent. Auburn, I watched their spring game a couple times, and I was very unimpressed with the receiving corps in particular. They took a transfer, Demetrius Robinson from Georgia. He's a guy that was a 5-star recruit, but transferred out of Cal, transferred out of Georgia. There's a reason for that. He hasn't really stuck. He got hurt early in his career, you have to understand, and I don't think he was the same guy at Cal coming off injury or at Georgia. And his game was explosiveness, and it's just not there anymore. Auburn does not have skill position talent on par with most of the SEC. They're average or below average at a lot of positions. The offensive line is probably not going to be particularly good. The defense should be solid. The secondary should be quite good, but the front seven is not what people are used to. And they got pushed around a lot last year very quietly. Weren't great in most metrics. They were a really mediocre defense in a lot of ways. So I don't see Auburn turning a corner. I don't see Harsin, who's not one to adopt modern RPO style stuff. He's a much more traditional spread guy, moving the needle there. And if they try to play Harsin brand vanilla football in this conference with their talent, it's not going to go well. And given how poorly they're recruiting, that is a school that I'm seriously concerned about declining in the next 2 to 3 years at a real clip to which it's going to be difficult to rebuild, especially, again, Oklahoma and Texas in the conference. It's going to really hurt Auburn because of their position and where they're at relative to the other schools. They suddenly get pushed down to being an average or lower half school. Johnny from Scarlet and Great, appreciate it. I mean, a lot of good supporters there. Johnny Lunsford, does the 12-team playoff make it okay for the Big Ten to just be okay? I think kind of so. I mean, you get into the playoff and see how you do. I think the big conferences are going to dominate the playoff more often than not. I think the big beneficiary for the 12-team playoff is going to be Michigan and Penn State because they keep getting denied access because Ohio State's so good. People like to talk about how great Alabama is, and it's a one horse race in the SEC. But I think the Big Ten's had the same problem. Ohio State's run away with the conference to such an extent that I think it's really negatively impacted those schools, not just immediate accomplishments, but also in recruiting, in brand awareness. They kind of get this mantra, right, where Harbaugh can't be anything more than third in his conference, and then that makes him a failure. If you can be third in your conference and actually make a playoff, then suddenly I think that narrative does change. And this is very different than how we're very critical of the G5 and thinking that they're going to be schools that get in and get blasted. I do think there's something to be said that some of those schools might get in, lose, having lost a close game to Ohio State. And in a 12 team where, 5 plays 12, there's going to be some upsets at like 8 through 10. And so maybe you do actually, maybe at least put it this way, you feel better about yourself for having gotten in at that level. Will NIL help teams get more elite players? The NIL is going to help the rich get richer, and it's going to pull from the poor. Simply put, if you're a starter, you're going to have more brand awareness. There's going to be a little bit in some G5s where being the starting quarterback at a G5 is better than being third string in Alabama or Ohio State. But the reality is, if you're Alabama or if you're Ohio State, if you're Georgia, Georgia wants a new starting quarterback. They don't have one. They're going to go grab one from most schools because you come in and you get an immediate endorsement deal with Atlanta. It's a lot of money, and they're just going to be able to pull any hole they have. And my real fear is that the G5 and lower tier schools are just going to turn into like a minor league, basically, where they're going to be first, second, third year training kids up. The big schools are going to take high boomer bust kids, the 5 stars that they think might develop into superstars. And then for consistency, they're just going to pull from other conferences a lot. It's definitely going to help the rich fill their polls, and it's going to hurt the poor, so to speak, because when you get a guy that's a high level quarterback or something, he's going to get ripped out away from you. It's going to create that divide. College football is still cyclical. I think. Well, first, the whole cyclical thing has always been a little bit of a misnomer because USC, Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame have been good for literally 100 years. And they've been a little cyclical with each other. But what's been cyclical is the teams at the very top have sort of traded off. Michigan, Nebraska, Penn State have been good throughout history. But I'm going to be blunt. It's not like they have half a dozen national titles at those schools. They've had periods where they were really good and were able to get to a national title realm. But I think the harsher reality you've got to accept is the cycle for Penn State or the cycle for Michigan has been we're a 10-win, what would now be a 10-win team, used to be more like an 8-win team, right? Consistently winning, and then occasionally we get to the point where we're in the national title discussion for a few years, and then we kind of go back down a little bit. Same thing with Penn State and Nebraska. That pushing up to the upper tier where you're in national title consideration is a different question. USC is the oddball there, but USC, that's not a cyclical issue. It's a funding issue and a structural issue. TV contracts, but also ways money is being allocated in the school. They don't have the same resources East Coast schools do, and so that's kind of why we are where they are right now. Let me scroll down. And Daniel, if you see interesting questions, start shooting them to me in Slack if you hear me. And then I can sort of pop them up. Are we headed to any games this year? I'm probably not. COVID sort of shot a hole in the few plans I have. Yeah, I'm so far down this list. I'm just going to catch up here. Do you guys see a chance for Saban requires and A&M becomes the team to beat? I mean, when Saban retires, no one knows who the team to beat is going to be. I think the truth is there's not going to be any team to beat. I think it's going to be a little bit more like the 90s in the SEC where things rotated off at a good clip. Does the move of consolidating conferences slow down playoff expansion? I think the answer is no. In a weird way, consolidated conferences, I think, demand more playoffs. I've always made the point that playoffs really have benefited the SEC because it gives more access. When you're in a tough conference, you're more likely to lose a game against other teams in the conference. So the more the conference gets big and harder, the more it kind of makes sense to have more slots because the SEC will beat itself up. And you're probably more likely to have multiple teams with 1 or 2 losses, and you're not sure who the champion should be. And so by expanding the playoff, you allow for multiple SEC teams to get in. And again, without true divisions, the number 1 versus number 2 dichotomy kind of breaks down even worse. I know we've already had 2017 where Alabama didn't win their division, but they probably were, they probably were better than Auburn. They only lose 1 game. Now we're even in much weirder land, you have to understand, because you might win your pod and end up 3rd. So you did win your division and you still didn't make a conference championship game. That's what kind of ends up demanding a playoff. I still think the playoffs are probably going to be pretty lopsided, and that's my personal biggest concern. One thing that a lot of people said in our videos was they were surprised to see Sarkisian in our top 10 coaches. And we try to make this clear whenever we do a top 10 or any sort of ranking, what's our methodology or our formula. And in that case, we try to be pretty clear. Our methodology was if I was a school right now hiring a coach, what is the top 10 list of coaches that I'd want to hire? Money be damned. And people talk about like Jimbo Fisher and Mac Brown and some of these other coaches, like, oh, they've won a national championship or they won conference championships. I think Sarkisian is red hot, and I think Sarkisian has had a lot of experience that's going to make him be a better coach. It's a little bit like Mario Cristobal that I even considered slightly for my list. Cristobal is a guy that I wouldn't have made my top 10 years ago, like when he was at FIU, I believe. And now that he's been in Oregon and taken some lumps, I think he's going to be a better coach. Dabo Swinney wasn't a great coach for 7 years in most people's mind. I mean, they didn't have a great record for 7 years until they turned the corner and sort of built a culture. And I think Sarkisian, he took an 0-12 Washington team over. He was more like a 7-win team at Washington. He had his demons. He had his demons when he went to USC. But that was not a small feat. They were not a good program at all. He recruited very well, turned it around, and I think in the current RPO era with his mind, his pro experience, and his ability to recruit at a high level, I just think he's, compared to Jimbo Fisher, that I don't think he's done a tremendous job. He hasn't recruited quite as well as people would have hoped, and he is definitely not adapted to the modern game. Mac Brown, I find funny when people raise that conversation. I said at the end of the video, which apparently people missed, I feel like Mac Brown could be a part of this conversation 2 to 3 years of top 10 coaches. But everybody just forgets that he got run out of Texas. I mean, he didn't maintain that program, and he was out of coaching for 5 years. It's a little premature, and it's not just looking at the new hot thing. It's also remembering how the other things ended or where they've been lately. Um, Someone asked the question if we think the SEC has reached the inflection point where the collection of talent will just continue to pull talent, even if teams are records are poor, like 6-6. That was one of the more fascinating aspects of um, the COVID 2020 season, in my personal view, because like LSU goes 5-5, and how is that viewed? Arkansas and Mississippi State. We talked a lot before the season that most teams have failed to have a winning record in conference play. You usually have a couple teams that go like 8-0, 7-1, and so they hand everybody a loss. And if you think of it this way, it's like everybody loses to Alabama, and then they go 500 against each other. Well, if you do that, you have a loss, and then either 4 losses, in which case you go 4 and what would that be, like 4-5 or whatever, or you have maybe fewer than that, but you're like in an 8-game conference season, or let me just back up a little bit because I'm confusing myself. 10-game conference season, you lose to Alabama. Now there's 9 games left, right? Best case, you go 5-4 in those games, or 4-5 if you're all straight even. If you go 5-4, add the Alabama loss, and now you're 5-5. If you go 4-5, now you're 4-6. So you're 500 or worse just by virtue of the fact that Alabama beat everybody. And I think people were very negative towards that. I think people had a hard time sort of accepting that a 5-5 record when you're playing entirely within your conference is actually fine. It just means you were average that year, and average in the SEC is still quite good. The big thing that will that is really, I think, required for momentum is the SEC has to continue to play outside the conference and win at a high level. I mean, if they go play outside the conference and they lose those games, there's sort of a momentum about how that sort of causes things to fall off. And in particular, the lack of out of conference games really makes it hard to judge one conference against each other. It's not just the championships and the playoffs. Look, Georgia got throttled by Texas a few years ago, or I say throttled, really wasn't throttled, but just got sort of pushed around a little bit. Oklahoma just took it to Florida last year, and that sort of does damage. But it's really the momentum of all the out of conference games and the domination in that, and in all of it that matters. And if they're totally isolated, then I don't think 5-5 is going to get it done in terms of brand awareness, which will trickle down to recruits, etc. But their ownership of the whole Southeast corridor is a big deal. And one thing I'm going to touch on, because Daniel just sort of mentioned it to me in our Slack. That ownership of a corridor is a big deal on a lot of levels in terms of exposure, right? It's not just the region. And if you've ever lived in the South, the most common water cooler talk in the fall is college football in a lot of states in the South. And so that's just going to continue to be the case. And when you're having those conversations, you're going to talk about SEC teams. And the kids of the people having those conversations are going to talk about SEC teams. And they're going to watch SEC teams. That's what's going to drive recruiting. But there's going to be even more of a national impact because of how the brand's going to show up on television. ESPN is going to own a huge chunk of the country, and they're going to know every game you watch with an SEC game is going to matter, and it's going to feel big stakes. The other broadcasters, like Fox in particular, with their contract with the Big 12 and the Pac-12, they're going to be really hurting, because if the Big 12 folds, it doesn't matter, if they pick up people even. They don't have the same sort of momentum behind their games. And if you're watching a Big 12 where Iowa State and Oklahoma State and Baylor are the front runners, and the bottom half of the conference is, Central Florida, Cincinnati, BYU, SMU, Houston, people aren't going to really care that much about a lot of those games. People aren't going to really tune in to watch Iowa State, Houston, or to watch Oklahoma State, UCF. And so all of a sudden now Fox's, their TV revenue is going to go down. That might cause them to reevaluate how they sponsor the contracts. That's going to cause them to give less money to the conferences. But, this is sort of doubly bad. I mean, less money for Fox means less money for the schools, and you're getting less money because you're getting less eyeballs. And at a certain point, people in Texas are just not going to care what happens with Texas Tech and TCU. I mean, I know some of you are Texas Tech and TCU fans, you know, watch those schools, but even the Texas Tech fans, truth be told, when they go to watch another game, they're going to go watch Texas and Texas A&M play SEC teams probably more often than they're going to want to watch UCF play Houston. Um, do we think ESPN tampered with the Big 12? I want to be a little careful touching on that topic. It depends a little bit on what you mean tampered with, right? Uh, I've got my own opinions about a cease and desist that you give to ESPN, who's an entertainment company but is also a news entity, and you're telling them not to contact any conference about anything, basically any outcome related to conference realignment. Um, those are public schools, and you're telling a news organization they can't contact a public entity about anything related to a news issue. That, in my mind, probably isn't tampering. I don't really have a dog in the fight, but I don't really see it. Now, you get into the whole tortious interference of a contract concept where maybe they are trying to get somebody to breach their contract or trying to create a situation where they don't meet their obligations or manipulate things. That isn't my forte, frankly. I don't want to go too far down that road, but I think there's a potential to say they've tampered with it if they've done some of those things in backdoor deals. I think as an organization, they may have almost inadvertently tampered with it by, having people in the conference talking to various ESPN personalities and just having conversations and sort of losing track as an organization of what you're doing, because there's a concept of agency, right? Your organization's doing stuff and you don't really realize that the people are making these statements with schools or other entities that represent you. But on the whole, I don't. People ascribe way too much to ESPN and Disney and sort of say that they created the SEC and this is all just SEC spin. I mean, the SEC is what they are because they've won title after title for years. And when they didn't win a title, it was another ACC school that's a lot like an SEC school in Clemson. ESPN doesn't cause people to win games. And people that think ESPN pays off referees and things like that, you're a little out of your mind. I think Texas and Oklahoma instigated this themselves, frankly, because they saw the writing on the wall with super conferences. That's the result of this shift towards NIL, which is it's going to make the rich get richer because they're going to be able to offer exposure for their players that no one else can offer. So they're just going to get even more of the top players. And the ability to take transfers in this free transfer market is a massive catalyst to this. Because what did we see with Ohio State when they made the playoffs the past couple of years? They did it on the back of a transfer quarterback that got immediate eligibility. Ohio State and Alabama and Clemson will never have a major hole in a major position ever again. They will never have that again. And when you throw NIL into the mix, it's just going to make it worse because now they have this financial incentive for people to transfer. It's not just about NFL exposure now. It's about real money now. And in that atmosphere, I think Texas and Oklahoma felt like it was inevitable that the SEC was going to get stronger. And I think this turns to maybe another part of the conversation, if I can forcefully shift it. I think what a lot of people realize is that the NCAA is not really interested in doing what they need to do to keep the sport competitive, at least at the top, and to keep the sport functional. And the big schools are concerned, I think, in the lack of NCAA enforcement, the failure of the NCAA to get in front of these NIL issues. And I think a lot of this move is actually probably due to some backdoor stuff that isn't really being discussed or isn't seen, where the administrators are just showing basically a lack of confidence in the NCAA. And that side of things that we don't ever see because those are conversations happening behind closed doors, I think is actually a really big part of why people believe that they're going to go to these super conferences. And, in that vein, if Oklahoma and Texas have sort of gotten a feel for that, they know the Big 12 is sort of on shaky ground. So we can go to the SEC now, get more money immediately, secure our future in a super conference world. And, quite frankly, I don't think Texas really cares what happens to TCU and Baylor. It may be cold, but I don't think they care. And so they did what they needed to do to be self-serving. My concern is the super conference world. I just don't think it's going to be as good for college football. But that the super conferences may be the way that they sort of preserve some level of sanity, that the sport doesn't just implode from the weight of what could be unmitigated pay for play. Somebody just asked, and that's Paul Dodd. I appreciate the question. Does that mean that we could potentially get 4 conference structure with a natural playoff structure with NIL focusing the top talent down to fewer schools? One, I really don't like the idea of 4 conferences and the champions all come and play in the playoff because, like we've said, in that, let's say the Pac-12 is one of the conferences and the SEC is one. The SEC with Oklahoma and Texas will frequently have 4 schools better than anyone the Pac-12 puts out. And that's going to make the playoffs suck because the Pac-12 champion is going to get blasted in the first round. And the second best team in the country may be in the SEC or the Big Ten. So I think that's why I say I actually am weirdly even more in favor of an expanded playoff when the conferences get huge, because you really need to consider that you might have the best team, multiple of the best teams in one conference. There's too many now. But I do think I put a tweet out about this, right? People talk about the G5s in college football and they'll talk about like big upsets. Well, what about Appalachian State or what about UCF in this game? Those teams are usually like 40th, 50th in most power rankings. Like they're not that low. There's 130. And in a given year, there are about 80 teams that are relevant and there are about 50 teams that are not. And something is cracking Daniel the heck up. I got to figure out. Uh, okay, I see the super chat. Thanks, Underhill Julian. I don't think you meant to type that. But I think what which one comes first? Maybe Tennessee propping their playoff cherry or humans on Mars. Um, at this point, humans on Mars. I'm actually not even joking. I think it might be humans on Mars. Tennessee's a historically good program, but they feasted on a weak surrounding set of schools, and they were kind of a national regional recruiter before that was a thing. I'm not sure they have the backing anymore to do that. But that was a good question. Super chat trying to give us $5 to cover the fact that we're going to be demonetized for the rest of time. So I really appreciate that one. But yeah, getting back to the point, I don't think a 64 team FBS is the worst thing. In fact, the thing I love more than anything was when people suggested having a G5 playoff and maybe that champion enters the FBS playoff or something, or just being separated. I think the biggest problem in college football isn't a lack of inclusiveness, it's bloat. We've added a ton of teams, and I don't know, I feel like it's got to be like 15 teams in the last 20 years. And it's about twice as big as it should be. If college football was more like 64 teams, then I think every week gets more exciting. Losses are going to start piling up, and a playoff makes more sense because there's more of a sense of parity. Someone asked how many wins for Texas A&M this year. That's hard to say. I mean, they return a lot of pieces. They had a lot of guys opt out of COVID. Some of those guys are coming back. I don't think people fully appreciate that. Their schedule's not bad. They have Colorado out of conference, if I remember right. Missouri and South Carolina should be their crossers. So I don't really expect any of those teams to be particularly good. And that means they've got a good chance to be successful this season. I think your take on A&M really comes down to how much do you think Kellen Mond was a good quarterback held back by a lack of receivers, which people don't give him enough credit for the fact that his receivers, due to opt-outs and then injury, kind of sucked. And how much was a quarterback that couldn't execute Fisher's system? I'm not sure the answer to that, but Their ability to get consistent quarterback play next year, I think, is going to determine it. I would think, given where they're at in terms of out of conference, I think 8-4 is probably a reasonable expectation. 9-3, maybe more like 9-3. I don't know who they lose to. I mean, you lose to, let's say you lose to Alabama. Your East opponents are pretty easy. I think they can beat the Mississippi schools. I don't really buy that LSU is going to be fully returning. So, I don't think 9 and 10 wins is unreasonable. It's a much easier schedule than they've had in recent years. Yeah, I don't know. It just depends. I haven't thought they've had good quarterback play or good offensive line play that much. They had good line play for the most part last year, but in recent years they haven't. So, how much does retooling of those positions really hurt them? That's the question I think you have to answer, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have an answer on that one. Thoughts on LSU this year? I feel like every time I talk on LSU, I make somebody mad, so I'm almost scared to talk about it. But look, maybe I'm not giving A&M enough credit now that I think about it. Maybe they are a 10 or 11 win team because I don't think Auburn's going to be very good this year. I kind of already hinted at that, and that'll come out in our previews. I do not like the roster, and I don't like the coaching moves or what I've seen too much. I think there will be a more sound program that's not going to drop stupid games, maybe, but I don't see their ceiling being better than 7 or 8 wins. And LSU, you got two guys that have bare minimal coordinating experience. One guy was a coordinator at William and Mary, I believe. They're all really young. You got a roster that was really incohesive last year. They've still got a lot of problems on defense. People love to talk up the secondary, but they've got a few really good pieces and not enough pieces. They don't have great safety play. The front seven is not particularly good. The front seven is very average, probably below average by SEC standards. Coming out of last year. And then offensively, they're just all over the place. I think if you talk about quarterbacks, I still think Brennan got a bad rap, and we tweeted about this, and I don't have all the factoids in front of me. I don't know if I could find them fast enough either. You kind of had a weird situation where Brennan got if you were to say 3 difficulty tiers, there was like a difficulty here, here, and here. TJ Finley played the teams up here. That was like Alabama and their ilk, the teams that were very, very good defensively. Arkansas was in that set. And then you had, they had teams that were not very good, like Missouri or Vanderbilt open the year, and that's who Brennan played. And then you had who Max Johnson played, who was generally really bad defenses, like Ole Miss. Florida was also pretty terrible defensively. I think it looks like they want to start Johnson, but I honestly, I'll just full disclosure. I think it's a bit of a game. I think Brennan's going to be the starting quarterback. I think they're saying all the right things to keep Johnson on the roster because they don't want him to transfer. In the current world of free transfers, they know if they took Brennan, maybe he'd bolt, or it's the other way around. But they're definitely playing a game to keep somebody on the roster. I think Brennan looked like the better quarterback initially. But the more I watched last year, the more I kind of second guessed it. Brennan was much more a function of the teams he played. I'm not sure who is the better quarterback there, but I will say I don't know that I would read too much from it. LSU's bad offensive performances all got put onto Finley's back. Johnson played in a lot of those games, and he had worse statistics than Finley did. We just kind of have glossed over him because we say, oh, that's Finley. But it wasn't just Finley. It was who they were playing. I don't have a lot of faith in LSU on a lot of levels. Someone made the comment that the next Michigan coach is Matt Campbell. That'd be interesting. I mean, the guy, let me just double check his resume real quick. Matt Campbell has a weird background to be a major head coach. He was the head coach of Toledo from 2012 to 2015, and then been the head coach at Iowa State since 2016. He has never been a coordinator or an assistant at a P5 program before he was at Ohio State. This is his first P5 job. His recruiting has been sub 50th in the country, behind Luke Fickell at Cincinnati. We talked about that in our top 10 head coaches video, which you should watch if you haven't seen it. And he's turned in good results. I mean, like 9-3 last year was a really good result, but 7-6 the year prior was a bit of a disappointment. 8-5, 8-5. He's been doing well. He hasn't been setting the world on fire. I think there's a reason he hasn't been hired away. I think he's a very good coach in terms of an all-around developmental guy, and I think he'll be very successful at a developmental program. I think the jump to major college football where he has to recruit at a top 15 level could be jarring. There has been nothing to indicate he can recruit like that. He doesn't sign top 40 classes. He doesn't have those connections. He doesn't have the connections in the coaching tree, which means he doesn't have connections to high schools and programs. Matt Campbell's an interesting one. He's going to need to he's got a tough road to hoe to be able to sort of build him up into something that people are going to trust. I mean, Urban Meyer came from Bowling Green, but remember, Urban Meyer was an assistant and had experience at P5s, and Matt Campbell just doesn't have that. Cookie Monster, the worst national championship winning head coach in recent memory. For me, the answer to that's probably no, because I remember what happened to Gene Chizik. And then you also had Lloyd Carr. I mean, there have been some really bad coaches that win national titles at talented schools. This happens about once every 8 years, actually. And I don't know. I think actually Orgeron is an okay coach, but I don't think he's an elite coach. I think he's very average. I don't like him running I don't think he's organized enough to be able to operate at the level you need to operate. And that's maybe the Campbell example. And to sort of wrap it all together, there's a different set of problems when you need to run an LSU or an A&M or an Alabama. You have to create a machine. I say Lloyd Carr. I meant Larry Coker, not Lloyd Carr. Same LC. Consonants getting the better of me. But you need somebody that's able to run this sort of machine. It's like it's a thresher. And there are all these moving parts to be able to take all this recruiting stuff and all the fitness and training and to run it effectively. Essentially, you have so many resources at your disposal that your ability to use those resources as efficiently as possible is how you gain an edge versus the other teams that also have great coaches and great use of resources. And coaches at a G5 level can really succeed just by being good coaches. They have good schemes. They develop players really well. And there aren't as many you might call them distractions, but it's more than distractions. I would say it's complications, more things you have to do right, more edges you have to have. If you're at a G5 and you're developing well, you tend to just get kids coming to your program because you're a winning program that don't go to the other G5s. If you're at a P5 and you're doing pretty well, you can still recruit poorly. Look at Dan Mullen and Jim McElwain. And it's a very different problem. And Ed Orgeron, I think, can be a good motivator. And he could be good he can be a good coach to set an emotional standard for your program if he has great coordinators that are very organized and do that aspect. The thing that's concerning for him is the lack of organization. Thoughts on what mass realignment could do to the coaching market? I mean, that's an interesting question because it's going to make being in one of those big programs more valuable. I don't know how much that really matters because the coaching market is already so volatile, and people are so, the P5s already have so much draw due to the monetary advantages. I think being at a Cincinnati or something, a UCF, is definitely going to be more of a stepping stone than it was. One thing I could see, and this is probably pretty notable, the idea of going from offensive coordinator at Georgia to head coach, whatever, like McElwain's path, Alabama to Colorado State to Florida, you may not go to the G5s anymore. If they break away, it may be cycling down to the bottom 64 and cycling back up again. So the best coordinators become head coaches. And so I don't know how hard it's going to be to jump from one division to the other. It's typically once you get outside a division like FCS to FBS, it's really hard to jump that at the same level, go from head coach to head coach. You almost have to go usually like FCS head coach to really bad G5, or mid-tier FCS head coach becomes a coordinator in the FBS level. It's always been a weird transition, and I think you could see that happen again where And that would actually slow the turn down to a certain degree because the pool of candidates to draw from is going to end up being smaller. But it does mean it would cannibalize themselves more. I need a question. Can Jimbo Fisher win a national title at A&M? Sure, he can win a national title at A&M. It's just very hard. It's hard to win a national title. It is very hard to win a national title. We see Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State be in that hunt so much that we think it's easy, and it's not. For them to be at the level they're at has required them to recruit at a top 3 level every single year. Alabama has more talent than anyone in the conference, maybe not named Georgia, but really including Georgia, and has more talent every year. And the gap between them and everybody else is pretty stark. LSU won a national title in 2019, and their recruiting rankings are nowhere close to Alabama. The gap between Ohio State and everyone in the Big Ten is a mountain. Same deal with Clemson in the ACC. A&M is going to have a much more difficult road because they're just not going to out-recruit to that extent. This is where you talk about like tradition or program history or fan support comes into play. The A&M logo carries a lot of weight. It makes you a top 15 program. That's a big deal. You're in the top 10% of college football on a consistent basis, top 10 team. They're going to be in the championship discussion. But winning a championship is just really hard because even if you manage to win the SEC, you've got to then beat the champions from the other conferences. You got to beat Clemson, you got to beat Ohio State, you got to beat whoever. And so I think they're going to be in the discussion more, but it's the same deal with Georgia, right? People want to rag on Georgia for being close but no cigar. How many teams in college football have been close to winning a national title in the past 15 years? What? It's like 5, 6? I think it's absurd that we ding Georgia for losing in overtime to Alabama in a national title. How many other teams have lost in overtime or won a title in the past 10 years, right? I mean, Alabama in 11 and 12. Auburn, I can see Daniel doing math in his head. Auburn lost the end of the game in 13 and Florida State won. So it's like 4. And then your Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson beating each other for years. So LSU, I mean, it's like 8 schools have ever been at the level that Georgia has been at. What could cutting scholarships do for parity? Not as much as you think because of the NIL and free transfer. If you cut scholarships, it just means that the big schools, ironically, I think would have to take even less players in recruiting because they need slots for transfers. They would take more transfers. You can't have somebody on your roster that you have to wait 4 years to play. You're going to have to play them immediately. And what that means is the big schools will draft, they're going to pull the 5 stars. They're going to play as freshmen and sophomores. And then they're going to fill out the rest of their squad. Maybe that's 50, let's say you cut to 65, right? 45 players will be them. They're going to be 5 stars, and they're going to take 15 a year, the top players they can. And they're all going to go to the top programs. And then everybody else is going to go to the other schools. And when they mature, the big schools are going to have their NIL deals, and they're going to have open holes, and they're going to take the transfers from the other ones to fill those holes. So your Ohio State is going to be a mix of the first-round draft pick, 5-star superstars, and the senior quarterback from Iowa State, and the right guard from Iowa, and that's what it's going to be. Theoretically, it would help parity just because it will make the sport more volatile. But the biggest thing I'll say is I personally hate cutting scholarships because you are cutting real scholarships to real kids. And the NFL players that are going to the NFL are going to get a scholarship anyway. What you're really hurting there, you're hurting, the bottom 3,000 kids a year that aren't going to go to the pro, and they're not going to get a college education anymore. That's a real thing. I made this point before, and people sort of take it weird, but it's a genuine issue. It's real kids that aren't going to go to college. If Georgia had picked the rec QB, they would have won. I kind of hate that argument, right? Justin Fields was not ready to be a quarterback in 2017 as a freshman. He didn't really know how to run the offense. When they did put him on the field for a fake field goal, he's the guy that screwed up, or a fake punt. He's the guy that screwed up the fake punt that would have won him the game. And Jake Fromm in 2017 was a really good quarterback. He had, um, he took his team, to the national championship overtime. In 2018, he was like 11-1 going to the SEC championship game. He was winning at the half of the SEC championship game in 2018. We view Fromm based off his last couple of years, and I think what we saw was a kid that had a ceiling. Um, and we forget that he was, in many ways, he was just as good as a freshman as he was, uh, maybe as a sophomore or a junior. But freshman year, so 2017, right? 9 yards per attempt, 24 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, 62% QB ratio. 9-yarder attempt a guy again in 2018, 30 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 171 QBR. And then we remember 2019 where he went down to 7.4 yards per attempt. His QB rating went from 170 to 140. They were in terrible shape at receiver. Cager, the transfer from Miami, was the best player they had. Pickens, as a freshman, was in and out of the roster with his own variety of issues, which he's had his whole career. Cager got hurt, and they really didn't have plan B or plan C. They were throwing to the tight end every play. And I think we forget how effective Fromm was because we saw his ceiling that junior year. And I think we also forget how bad his circumstances were. But as that 2017 season, 2018 season, Fromm was really effective. And 2018 in particular, when he was a sophomore and Justin Fields was on the roster, Fromm had shown everything to believe. 67% passer, 30 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, that he could be the guy for Georgia. And so I think it's pretty silly to say that Fromm is the reason that cost him. And it's also worth pointing out that Fields had far better skill talent at Ohio State than he ever had at Georgia. And I think there's a very good argument to make that if they had run the right offense for Fields did a better job of showing the athleticism of the quarterback, Fields could have been more successful, but that wasn't the offense they ran. And you build the offense in the spring and the summer, and they built it around a quarterback that had just lost in overtime as a freshman in the national title. I think Fields might have taken the job from him the same way that Tua took the job from Jalen Hurts, but Tua didn't take that job till halftime in the national title game himself, and he'd gone through spring practice and everything, and I just don't think Justin Fields was there yet as a freshman. It was that argument is just, put it simply, it's really unfair to compare sophomore and junior Justin Fields at Ohio State to freshman Justin Fields that we never saw, because freshman quarterbacks are just rarely anywhere near as good. The one other thing I'll note is, and I don't know if this was in chat or, Bleach Orange is talking about Jamie Newman got a lot of hype out of nowhere. That was one of the weirder things, and I've actually heard some people in the media say that there was kind of a media push to hype Newman when he transferred from Wake Forest and turn him into being this big superstar, and they were kind of trying to pump Georgia. And the word from a lot of people I've talked to is they never got it. Like the NFL scouts, the serious analysts, and the talent scouts for recruiting services never understood the Jamie Newman hype. I didn't understand it when I watched the tape. Daniel and I a lot of times will just shoot YouTube videos back and forth. Like one of us will randomly pick up something and watch it, and we'll send each other time clips. And I never saw arm talent that made me think he was a high-level quarterback. I mean, he was in a run-first offense. He was mostly effective, wasn't crazily effective. He reminded me a lot of kind of a James Franklin in Missouri. I mean, it's kind of what he reminded me of. Kelly Bryant. He seemed like the same kind of player. The idea that he was going to be a superstar just, frankly, I think it was and we were really vocal. Let me be clear. We were really vocal that we didn't get it. Going into the season, I said Georgia would be a 3-loss team last year. I got roasted on a spit for that. I wasn't wrong. I realized they had major issues at quarterback. I talked about the fact that I thought their defense was phenomenal, but I didn't think they could score. I thought the quarterback situation was so bad. Once it came out that JT Daniels still hadn't been practicing, because I knew Daniels had the potential to be sort of a right the ship guy. I still don't know if Daniels is quite what he's being hyped out to be. And before you jump on me, the reason I say that is he played really bad defenses that, like when they played Mississippi State, I think it was 4 out of 5 starters in the secondary were injured or had opted out by that point. And the same thing happened like with South Carolina, where their top corner had opted out of the game. We don't know what he looks like against a good defense yet, but I think he's capable of beating a good defense in some way. And I didn't think they were going to do that with a walk-on quarterback. I just didn't. And I never saw anything from Newman that made me think that, especially statistically, he was not a particularly good quarterback. All right. All right. Another question. We're about an hour 15 in. I don't know how long we're going to go. So if you guys want to throw up some random questions in chat for me, I'll try to jump to them. I haven't had the chance to dig into Jack Cohn yet. One thing that's tough for us, we're not beat writers and we don't work for ESPN. I don't get to see practice. So I think somebody was making fun of us for watching it was the Auburn spring game. And somebody asked me a question and I said I wasn't very impressed with them. He said, well, why in the world are you relying on a spring game? And the answer for that's pretty simple. It's the only thing I can look at. So I look at last year and I look at the spring, and that's all we can prognosticate. We're pretty open about the fact that we don't have a lot of confidence in our own opinions until 3 or 4 games in. I will say one thing going into this season. I don't know that the middle of the pack in the SEC is going to be that great. There are a lot of signs to me of a bit of a down year. Arkansas feels like they've felt like they were getting better, but I think maybe that was a little bit of fool's gold. I think Ole Miss is doing some things right. It's going to depend on whether they can turn things around defensively. Mississippi State's going to be better offensively in the second year of Leach's system. I don't know if they'll be great, but they're not going to be a nothing burger. But usually there's a few tiers in the SEC. You've got your like super elites, and then you got these like usually around 4 or 5 teams that are sort of at the second tier, borderline BCS bowl level. And those are usually ones where one of them will end up in a BCS bowl and lose to somebody close. But they'll be like SEC number 5 or 6 playing Big Ten number 2. That group looks kind of weak, to be blunt. Florida's rebuilding, Auburn's rebuilding. Your people are hoping LSU and LSU rebounds. People are hoping A&M maintains their momentum, but you need some teams to really step up because outside, Alabama, I'm pretty sure is going to be good. Georgia, I'm pretty sure is going to be good. A&M should be pretty good. Don't really have a confident fourth. Just don't. It could be a number of different teams, and you can make your argument for any of them, and I'm not going to combat it. But there's not anyone in particular that I would say like 70% chance they're really good this year. So I think the middle of the pack might have a little bit of a problem. Someone's asking how good Bryce Young is. So I'm going to give a shout out to Matt Wyatt if you've never seen his channel. And he's done a lot of really awesome QB breakdowns. And I watched a video the other night when I couldn't sleep where he broke down every throw Bryce Young made last year. And you can also find on YouTube, I watched the spring, it was just like every throw Bryce Young made in the spring game. And he's an interesting one because his arm talent is really good. He's got a quick release. He has a lot of velocity on the ball. I don't know that he's got quite the baseball arm that Kyler Murray has, but he does some of the same sort of the thing that's so in vogue, right? Off base throws against his body, stuff that's not things that you're supposed to do as a quarterback, and he does it naturally, and he does that a lot. He's also an extremely good athlete. He's quite quick and fast. I think like maybe a weird hybrid of Murray and Tua as shorter quarterbacks. He's more accurate maybe than Murray is. I don't think he has quite the same physical gifts in terms of explosiveness, running or throwing. But if you sort of take the average of two, that's where he's kind of playing. Now, is he as good as either? I don't know. But all the tools are there. It's just going to be a matter of how much he can mentally pick it up. But the guy seems to be scary accurate. He seems to have tremendous ability to anticipate, his arm talent seems to be just really off the charts. And he's very athletic. And he, coming out of Mater Day, he played absolutely the best. In high school, he played teams that are better than a lot of college teams, genuinely. So, another follow-up question somebody said was, how do we feel about Bill O'Brien? Look, Bill O'Brien was not a great GM at the Houston Texans. Now, you can get into a lot of dynamics with that if he was just trying to get in control of the locker room. Maybe for a minute I thought it was going to be funny if Hopkins decided that he was just going to retire because of the vaccine policy. That suddenly that terrible trade didn't look as bad. But I think you really need to go back and look at Bill O'Brien's time as a coordinator and Bill O'Brien's time at Penn State and what they did offensively, and he was very effective. And in general, these pro offensive coordinators have been really good in college. And I think when you pair them with a guy that is a quarterback capable of making NFL throws where they can use the real NFL playbook, they've been very successful. So in that coordinator role, I don't know exactly what to expect, but O'Brien has been very successful in the past, and I expect he'll be very successful now. So I don't really expect a massive step back, or at least I don't think we should see one. He's never really had a problem in terms of ability to scheme plays and run an offense. His issues are about running a program and personality and culture. He's not in control of that as a coordinator, so that kind of takes that off the table. Oklahoma's offensive line this year. I will own up to the fact that I haven't really dug into that. We do our prep slowly but surely, and there's a lot of prep to be had. I will say this, Oklahoma, the past few years has relied very heavily on the dominance of their offensive line. And I think that's been the most underrated aspect of Lincoln Riley's program. Particularly a couple years ago, we talked about this all the time in 2018. They won games by the ability to run the ball for 8 yards whenever they wanted it. People were terrified of Murray's legs as a scrambler, and their power game was incredible. And I'm just not 100% up to speed, so I'm afraid to say a whole lot about Oklahoma's offensive line and how much they've sort of retooled from where they were a few years ago. But their ability to really succeed in the power run game is really important to that scheme. I think that's going to go a long way to success. That's just something I need to dig into and do more research on, frankly. Is there a team we think will disappoint this year and who's overrated? Well, if you talk disappointing, you have to kind of go by where teams are ranked. So I'm going to pull up the Four Letter Network's top 25 right now, or they're way too early. They've got Oklahoma 1, which I don't have a problem with. I think given what they're returning defensively, I know they and the fact that they've got a ton of talent offensively, I think that's a completely fair take. Alabama 2, that's fine. Georgia 3, I think that's fine. Clemson, Ohio State, Iowa State's a big one. They were good. They weren't great, and I don't know how high the talent ceiling is of that team in general. And they return a ton of guys, like 10 offensive starters, 9 defensive starters. They should be a really solid team, but it's the Jake Fromm problem. I think sometimes we just assume that if you return a ton of starters, you're going to suddenly get a lot better. Brock Purdy's played a long time, and he's been up and down his whole career. I don't necessarily believe that Iowa State is suddenly going to get that much better, given that they've been mainly, blue collar is kind of a crappy way to say it, but they've been sort of a blue collar team. I don't think there's a lot of undeveloped talent that's going to explode, and that's what makes these big teams like Oklahoma and Georgia shoot up the rankings. Another one that I named was North Carolina. Everybody is focusing on the fact that they returned Sam Howell and all 5 starting linemen. I think the losses of Carter, Williams, Newsom, and Brown are a huge deal, and I don't think those losses are going to be easily replaced. So yeah, I think having them in the top 10 maybe a little over aggressive. I mean, I could go down the list, but at some point, when you start even by like the top 15th, 16th, like, Florida is predicted at 17th in their poll. I mean, if Florida finishes 9-3 or 8-4, they're going to be about that ranking. So it's kind of hard at that point to say who's really a disappointment. And I'll say this from Daniel. His point was that Oklahoma, Alabama, or Ohio State being number 1, he has no problem with, but he's got concerns about Clemson, and I think that's fair. Clemson has sort of gotten a pass for rebuilding in recent years, but they didn't rebuild that much. We've talked a lot that 2016, 2018 championships were both won with the same defensive line that, in my opinion, probably was the best defensive line in the history of college football. They had, 4 first-round draft picks on that line, and it was just insane. I mean, they all started as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and they won title when they returned for their senior year, which was almost unheard of. But Lawrence is a huge blow that let them do some unique things offensively. Rodgers was an important part of the team, but Travis Etienne won them games straight up. The Syracuse game last year, they were in trouble for about a half, and they said we're just going to hand it to Etienne, and he just ran away with it. I think he's a guy that they're going to really miss, and they don't have the same depth. Their recruiting classes are highly ranked because they've got a lot of number 1 at their positions, but they haven't really recruited across the board well. The offensive line is not stellar. It's above average, but it's not all world right now. And yeah, I mean, I could see that argument. There's a ton of defensive talent. Oh, okay. Daniel's clarifying that that wasn't his comment; it was somebody else's. You got to put it. He'd been sending everything to me in quotation marks, and when he sent one without it, I just stupidly assumed it meant something. But yeah, I think I don't think it's crazy to think that Clemson will take a step back. I think it's safe to say believe it when you see it, but there's a lot of 5-star defensive talent that it looks like it's just not going to pan out, and the back 7 has some weird fits, and they're going to lose Kendrick to Georgia, right? So this is an actual question from Daniel, which is what happens to the Georgia-Clemson loser. And you can tell me what you think happens, Daniel, because you have the ability to type to me. But everyone knows the Clemson-Georgia winner is going to be in a front row seat to the playoff. That feather in their cap is going to put them in a position where they can probably lose a game and they're the first one in. What happens to the loser, and how much does that matter? I think if the loser doesn't lose another game and then win the conference, they're automatically in. And Georgia would be in a really weird position because let's say Georgia loses to Clemson and then they lose, I don't know, they lose to Florida, run the table, beat Alabama in the SEC championship. You've got a 2-loss SEC champion that Clemson may be in the playoff. Do you put them in? And that would be, I think, one of the more difficult decisions. And let's say they beat Alabama, and that's Alabama's only loss. So Georgia has 2 losses. They're the SEC champion. Alabama has 1 loss. Their only losses in the conference championship game. I think you're in a situation where you get 2 SEC champions. So I think the short version of it is Clemson, it's a bit of an elimination game. And with Georgia, it's not. I think they can lose that game and pretty readily get back in. I'll say the biggest problem for Clemson is once you're out of that Georgia game, they don't play Notre Dame this year. Notre Dame's not going to play in the ACC championship this year, and I just don't know that they have a chance to get another marquee win. It's a weak schedule. after that, and they've so if you don't know, it's like Sacramento State, I think, Georgia Tech, North Carolina State, Boston College, Syracuse, Pitt, Florida State, Louisville, UConn, Wake, South Carolina. They don't play North Carolina. They don't play Miami. So Clemson's schedule is just too weak to afford a loss to Georgia. I think it's just really hard. Somebody put in a quote: "Returning starters are only a good thing if the starters are good." That's a point I always try to make. Returning starters are an important thing in college football, but returning starters is important from teams that are really good because those starters were good. And sometimes we think returning starters from a second or third tier team, and that's where I'm talking about with Iowa State. Returning starters from a team that was good but not necessarily great doesn't mean you're going to necessarily be great, I think. Sometimes, especially you look at like the Alabamas and LSUs, some of their better years come when they have a lot of turnover because they replace players that, weren't as good with 5 stars that are going to be end up first round draft picks. Leach Orange was mentioning the offensive line. And yeah, I try to mention that. The offensive line is, I think, the question mark. The defense, when I talk about the defense, I think the defense will be good, but the defense really wasn't great last year. They weren't great. They hadn't been great all year. They were really athletic, and that overwhelmed a lot of teams in the ACC. But Clemson and a number of games overpowered it mainly through the ground game, through ETN, and through Lawrence's sort of unique ability to put the ball. He could put the ball downfield on a rope in a way few people could, and it was difficult for a lot of teams to defend. And I'm just curious how they handle that.
I didn't understand that.
My Samsung watch is trying to get in the podcast. And it's relative, right? I mean, underachieving for Clemson is still going to be a top 10 season. I don't think they're going to be bad. It's just with their schedule, if they lose to Georgia, they're in a tough spot. Period. Clemson. Now here's a question nobody's raised. If Clemson loses a game, will they get jumped by a one-loss SEC? And there's a real stinking shot that they would. If they lost to Georgia, Georgia goes undefeated and loses to Alabama in the conference championship game, and that's out. And Georgia's one loss and Alabama's undefeated. Clemson is absolutely out. And if Georgia goes into the conference championship game with only one loss but beats Clemson, I'm not sure if a conference championship loss is necessarily going to knock them out over Clemson. Their schedule is really weak. If you're a Clemson fan, you need to be a really, really big Florida State fan. You need to be a big Pitt fan, Louisville fan, and South Carolina fan. You need those schools to be good enough to build up your resume, because if they're as bad as they've been the past couple of years, your resume is almost G5 level after that Georgia game. Playoff predictions, and if Ole Miss is actually going to play defense this year. Personally, I think I see the playoff as likely. I'm usually boring, and I'm usually boring because boring is usually right in college football at the very top. I think it's going to be Ohio State. I think it's going to be Oklahoma. I think it's going to be Alabama. And I would say a more than 50% shot that it's going to be the winner of the Clemson and Georgia game. So if you were to name those 4, whoever wins Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and Oklahoma, I think you're going to get 3 of the 4 of that group. I do. It could be somebody else out of nowhere, but I don't know who it would be. And then with Ole Miss, there's a philosophical point here. Teams that run really high tempo RPO offense seem to never play decent defense. Now, Ole Miss has been bad defensively for a long time, and there is a massive correlation between defense and recruiting quality. Defense almost always is a result of seniority and talent. And talent actually trumps seniority, but you can get so senior that you can be really good. And if you have super, super senior talented guys, which is what Georgia started last year before they lost 4 or 5 guys to injury. That people do not process that Georgia's defense in the second half of the season was by the Florida game was a shell of what had played Alabama earlier in the year, and that's why people didn't understand the Florida versus Alabama, Florida versus Georgia, Georgia versus Alabama triangle. Georgia got hurt in the interim. That's the missing piece. Ole Miss doesn't have talent, and they don't really have experience, so I can't really see them being good. And then when you're an RPO team, I just think the nature of practice where they run at tempo and they kind of practice being able to run at tempo doesn't let the defense ever learn how to get in a rhythm and learn how to react to motion. They don't usually let the defense hit. They don't put the defense in winning situations where the defense can get used to doing things right. And in either side of the ball in football, I'm kind of a believer that if you let one side win a lot in practice, they get really good, and the other side gets as much or more bad. And we saw that at times with Gus Malzahn's offenses at Auburn. I think we've seen it a lot with Riley, and I think we saw that with last year with Ole Miss. I'm running out of steam. If you can hear, I'm trying to drink water. If you can hear my voice, I'm not going to be able to go too much longer. So, if you guys have any wrap up questions, speak now or forever hold your peace, because I'm not going to be able to do much more speaking. Any chance for Oregon to make the playoff after losing to Ohio State? Yeah, I think so. Losing to a top team is not fatal. And as bad as the Pac-12 has been, I think they will be perceived to be better than the ACC that Clemson will have played. The ACC may be better than the Pac-12. Clemson does not play Notre Dame. They don't play UNC. They don't play Miami. They don't get the better part of the ACC. They get a really bad rotation, which is gonna. If you're Clemson, it's a bad thing. Oregon has a bit of a one-up there. But they would need to run the table, and they would need to look fairly good in doing so. Who wins, Washington or Michigan? I don't know. I mean, Michigan was such a disaster last year that it's hard to make any real prediction there. And then we barely saw the Pac-12 last season, so I'm not even gonna. I'm scared to even hazard a guess, frankly. Wisconsin actually good, or is last year a sign of things to come? Wisconsin is a team built around physicality and execution, and I think those teams really suffered in COVID. It was such a weird year, and especially with a lack of spring football. And there were like quarterback situation at Wisconsin probably would have gotten figured out a lot earlier. A lot of teams, Mike Norvell is one I keep hearing about Florida State. I keep hearing that Mike Norvell is turning around the culture at Florida State, and he's turning around, again, coaching is a lot about organization, especially at these big schools, that they didn't know what they had when they got there. They never had spring practice. They had limited summer. And it wasn't until the season that they discovered that they had some major problems. They went out and got Mackenzie Milton, so they fixed the quarterback position. I don't think they realized how deficient it was, and they never had a chance to fix it. But I think that's an example of how some coaches kind of got blindsided by their own teams. But last season, I think we did this thing where now this was before COVID, so we didn't know what the situation was going to be. But we said that we thought Florida State had a chance to really improve under Norvell. And we felt like Taggart had so underachieved that people forgot Florida State was still really talented and they could be a lot better. I think that might actually happen this year. I have Iowa because of Wisconsin's offense being so bad. What do you guys say in Texas and OU when they join the SEC? Does football suddenly mean more to them? Football's always been a big deal in Oklahoma and Texas, but I think the thing they'll see, much like with Texas A&M, is it's a little different when everybody else with football, with Texas, Oklahoma, and A&M when they're in the Big 12. football was a huge deal to them, but it was a much bigger deal for them than it was for a lot of the other teams in the conference, quite frankly. It's not that big of a deal in Missouri. It's not that big of a deal in Iowa, for Iowa State. It wasn't Baylor are big fans. Florida fans, Georgia fans, Alabama fans, LSU fans are every bit as rabid as Oklahoma and Texas fans. And I think one of the things that really made A&M sort of get comfortable was the realization that they care about this as much as we do, and they didn't look down on A&M as being lesser. Really, they sort of learn how to integrate themselves, but it's a much more of a peer relationship, and it's really, frankly, I've always enjoyed it. It's really fun being in a conference and being able to see the fan bases where the other fan base cares as much as your fan base does, and to see those interactions. I think that's going to be the thing that makes an impression on Oklahoma and Texas. What ACC is the team is the next one up? I already kind of said that. I think it's Florida State. I actually like what Miami has going, but they can't get the pieces together. Really wonder with Rhett Lashley if he got a bad rap coming out of Auburn. He kind of got caught in a bad year and was put in purgatory. Maybe he was a better quarterback than anybody gave credit for. Can the model make predictions based on expected production from returning starters? No, not as currently written. If I were to make a prediction based off returning starters, I'd just predict based off last year's team is what it would do. It's so tied to actual production. And I would have to create some sort of stand-in for recruiting, and I just don't want to do that. The point of the model we run is to have something that is entirely driven by real-world data that we can base ourselves off of. And it's neutral in the sense that I really don't weight things. The model is self-balancing. It looks at prior results and figures out what the weights should be, and it's designed to give me feedback that I can then figure out how I want to use. And when you do preseason predictions from any source, you have to weight returning starters and recruiting rankings and all these things, which means you inject your opinion of how much that stuff matters. I could do that, but it's more work than I have time for, and it really would just reflect my own opinions on what matters in college football. Oklahoma and Texas, did they take a dip? You should rewatch the start of the video. We actually covered that at the beginning. So if you just popped on at the end, start back at the beginning, a lot of the big questions we got in early. LSU was a big one we talked about. We actually at some point need to try tracking our model and how it does. And if anybody gets bored and wants to go back in our videos and see how we did against the spread, that'd be wonderful, because it's not like we're hiding the ball. We start to write it down in a journal, and you guys don't know how much of a struggle it is for us to record for 3 hours to do a couple videos a week. It's every bit of time we can spare to do that, and we just never take to go back to the previous week and look at the model from that week and the results and tabulate it. Will be tough. But yeah, Daniel does make a point. The model takes 4 weeks to get going, and as you guys know, a lot of team seasons were 7 games, so it was dealing with junk data for literally half the year, and we usually don't even run it for 4 weeks. I refuse to, because it just doesn't spit out anything useful for about 3 or 4 weeks, and we had to use it a lot earlier than we were comfortable, because otherwise we were never going to get to. Stuff like ACC courting Penn State, that's a question for somebody like Josh Pate, that's a friend of both of ours. I was texting him today, joking with him about being an Iowa State simp, but he owns it. Do we have a GitMub? No, the model's a secret. It's just something I wrote and need to translate. Yeah, we could. Josh Heupel gets fired or Tennessee wins games 2 years in a row. I don't think they're going to pull the trigger quick on Heupel. I don't know how he'll turn it around, but there's talent at Tennessee. They really shouldn't be bad. The Garantano saga was a mess. They should have. I don't understand. The biggest thing to me with that coaching staff 2 years in a row was the failure to understand what they were working with. When they lost the BYU game, and then it escapes me, the other G5 game, the bad one they lost that couple years ago, they started a roster that had no business starting, and they overhauled most of the defensive roster. Ended up beating Auburn a couple weeks later, as I recall. And it really came down to the fact that they didn't realize these players are bad and these players are good. Tohoto was a freshman, and they were trying to play some more senior guys, and they were just getting run by all the time. Like they couldn't stay with the running backs out of the backfield and such, and that was a major coaching failure. I think Heupel is going to do a better job of that. I think the question for Heupel is whether he's going to be able to recruit and manage the program again at that sort of high level machinery, and that remains to be seen. But in the new recent future, I have a hard time seeing them do better or do worse than Pruitt was doing, given the talent was there, because Pruitt did recruit quite well. We do not do it in Python. We're both programmers, actually. I was an engineer before I was an attorney. That was a long time ago. I'm older than I look, but he could do it in Python. I couldn't probably do it in Python anymore. Well, I could, but it would take me some time. But it's just the math's not that complicated. There's a formula in it that's a little bit complicated, but it's mostly just database stuff when you're doing a model. Database manipulation. Who's in Mississippi longer, Leach or Kiffin? That's interesting. I love that question. Who's in Mississippi longer, Leach or Kiffin? I'm going to say Leach because Mississippi State is a more patient school and Kiffin is less stable. I don't know that there's a clear answer because I could see Leach doing quite poorly. But Mississippi State is a really hard school to win at, guys. Dan Mullen is not a great recruiter. He wasn't a great recruiter at Mississippi State, but being consistently successful at Mississippi State is rare historically. It's just mainly due to the division they're in and the recruiting surroundings. It's just extremely hard to win on a consistent basis because you can be a top 40 program, and this is where people bash the SEC, but this is hard truth. If you're a North Carolina State level program, or you're historically an Iowa State level program, or in I don't know, Minnesota is probably a good example. Historically, now I know Minnesota's had great teams and Iowa's had great teams, but I'm saying historically, and you were in the SEC West, you can frequently find yourself losing 5 or 6 games a year just because you've got to play Auburn and you've got to play LSU and you got to play Alabama and you got to play Texas A&M, and then you're playing in the East Georgia, and now you're at 5 losses. And those can all be top 10 teams. It's just brutal to be in the SEC West. And Mississippi State's probably not as good as those teams I just listed off in terms of programming historic. They're not Iowa, and they're not Iowa State. And generally, Mississippi State's administration has been aware of who they are, to their credit. Ole Miss, they expect to be a little more, rightly or wrongly. And so I think Kiffin's either going to flame out, or if he does well, he'll jump ship and go somewhere bigger. Moorhead was fired because he lost control of the team. There's a lot to that story. They joked that Moorhead was fired when one of his players hitched his leg up and relieved himself like a dog and lost a game. Moorhead, or no, that was Luke. God, that was a weird period. But Moorhead had lost. I've heard from several people, and again, I don't want to out him, but I feel like at some point, Wyatt is an interesting guy to listen to with Mississippi State. He's very well plugged in. And a lot of people have sort of hinted at or outright talked about the culture of that program and accountability had fallen apart. And he was let go really more than results on the field, which had gotten pretty bad. And he wasted the best defense in the past 40 years at Mississippi State. They had the top-ranked defense in the country in 2018, and they were not very good. But the culture of that program fell apart. All right, guys. I'm about out of steam, and I'm not seeing more questions. So, did we ever reveal which school we had? We've not. I don't know if we ever will. If you chose to dox us, and somebody will dox us at some point, and we'll delete them and block them. But I'd like to think if you found out, you'd be like, "Oh, that's not surprising," but I didn't really know that, and you'd have that kind of a boring response. But we know the moment you guys find out who we root for, or who we grew up rooting for, or where we went to school, you're just going to assume that that's the team we root for. Anyway, all right, guys. Well, it's been fun, and we're going to keep trying to do stuff through the season. Try not to burn ourselves out before we get to football season because it's a long season for us. We can try to keep doing previews. The more you guys like and share our videos and Twitter and all, it helps. Again, this is a labor of love. We're not out here to be millionaires, but Twitter and YouTube algorithms are a thing. And if our stuff isn't getting watched or shared, it just disappears. And I'm kind of essentially saying, if you want us to keep doing content, it's only really worth it to us if people are watching it. And if there's not interest in sharing it or liking it, it tends to disappear. We don't get the audience, and that really might not be as worth it for us. So the support's great, and you guys in the chat in particular, and especially the super chat guys, which I really appreciate. Show a lot of support, and we appreciate that. And it's fun for us because you guys seem to enjoy it. But we truly don't do this for our own egos. We don't do it to hear ourselves talk. We do it because we both, especially me, I obsessively love college football, and I'm pretty bad. I live in I'll tell you guys, I live in Washington, D.C., and every time I talk to somebody, their eyes start to glaze over because I just talk about football all day if I could. And so any excuse I get to talk about it's a good thing. So, all right, guys, have a great weekend, and as Daniel would say, God bless.